Imagine waking up in the Middle Ages. No alarm clocks, just the smell of damp straw and the sound of rats scurrying across your floor. Welcome to medieval Europe, where bedtime was less about counting sheep and more about avoiding fleas. Tonight, we'll explore why sleep was a luxury few could afford, and how people survived nights filled with discomfort, danger, and downright bizarre remedies. If you think your mattress is bad now, wait until you hear what they used to sleep on. Dim the lights, get cozy, and let's drift back to a time when nighttime was anything but restful. You think your mattress is lumpy? Try sleeping on a sack of hay infested with bugs. Medieval beds were hardly the plush, supportive surfaces we take for granted today. For most people, bedtime meant lying on a thin layer of straw spread directly on the dirt floor of their one-room home. The wealthy might have an actual bed frame, but even then, their mattresses were just sacks stuffed with whatever materials they could find, usually straw, hay, or if they were lucky, feathers. Archaeologists digging through medieval garbage pits and home sites keep finding evidence of bed bugs and old bedding materials. These pests thrived in straw and fabric that made up medieval sleeping arrangements. Imagine trying to rest while countless tiny insects crawl across your skin, biting and feeding all night long. The video source puts it bluntly: lice left you alone last night, but probably not. That was your average night's sleep in the Middle Ages. Shared beds were completely normal, the whole family squeezing together on one mattress. Travelers at inns would often share beds with complete strangers. Imagine having to sleep pressed against a stinking, lice-ridden stranger after a long day's journey. This close quarters living helped spread diseases rapidly through communities. Your bedmates' fleas became your fleas, their lice your lice, and their sickness your sickness. The bedding materials themselves caused problems beyond just pests. Straw and hay provided minimal insulation against cold stone floors in winter. Dampness seeped up in the ground, making mattresses musty and moldy. In summer, the same materials became heat traps, turning beds into sweltering nests of itchy misery. You'd wake up sweaty, covered in bug bites, and stiff from lying on uneven lumps all night. Cleaning these beds was nearly impossible. Most people couldn't spare the time or resources to regularly replace bedding materials. Straw would break down into dust. Feathers would clump and poke through fabric, and all would become permeated with sweat, skin flakes, and insect waste. The wealthy might have servants turn and beat their mattresses occasionally, but this just redistributed the bugs rather than eliminating them. Bed frames, when they existed, weren't much better. They were often just rough wooden platforms with ropes stretched across to support the mattress. The ropes would stretch and sag over time, creating uneven sleeping surfaces. Some beds had posts and curtains to keep out drafts, but these just trapped heat in summer and condensed moisture in winter. The curtains also made it harder to spot and remove pests before going to sleep. Sleep positions were limited by these terrible beds. Side sleeping was nearly impossible on lumpy straw mattresses without proper support. Back sleeping meant feeling every piece of broken straw poking through the thin mattress cover. Stomach sleeping would press your face into the musty bedding. Most people probably slept curled in fetal positions, trying to minimize contact with the awful surface beneath them. The concept of changing sheets regularly didn't exist. Fabric was expensive and time-consuming to make, so bed linens were used until they literally fell apart. Blankets were rare. Most people slept in their day clothes, adding body oils and dirt to the already filthy bedding. Fleas and lice happily lived in the seams of clothing and bedding, ensuring constant irritation. Sleep itself must have been fragmented and restless. Between scratching bug bites, adjusting to find a comfortable position on the lumpy surface, and waking up cold or overheated, proper rest was hard come by. The wealthy might have servants to tend the fire through the night, but even they couldn't stop the pests or make the bed actually comfortable by modern standards. And if you thought the bedding was bad, wait until you hear about the night air. Medieval people had some truly terrifying beliefs about what happened when you open a window after dark. Ever been told to get some fresh air? In medieval Europe, that was basically a death sentence. People back then didn't just dislike night air. They genuinely believed it could kill you. Windows stayed shut tight after sunset, trapping all the lovely smells of smoke, sweat, and human waste inside. Forget about cracking a window for some ventilation. That was inviting disease and evil spirits straight into your home. The air inside medieval houses was thick enough to chew, with the fireplace constantly burning for heat and cooking. Smoke filled every room. There were no chimneys as we know them, just holes in a roof that let some smoke escape while the rest lingered. Your eyes would water constantly from the acrid haze. Breathing felt like inhaling through a wet wool blanket. And that was before you factored in the stench of chamber pots that rarely got emptied properly. Medical texts from the period treated night air like poison. Doctors warned that miasmas, foul-smelling air they thought caused disease, were strongest after dark. Some believed demons and evil spirits traveled in the night breeze. One 14th century physician wrote that sleeping near an open window could cause humoral imbalance, leading to fevers and death. People took this seriously. You'd no more open a window at night than you'd drink from a plague victim's cup. This fear created perfect conditions for respiratory diseases to thrive. Sealed-up homes became breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis. The constant smoke exposure damaged lungs over time. Peasants who worked outdoors all day would come home to breathe even worse air inside. Children suffered most. Their smaller lungs couldn't handle the constant irritation. Many probably died from a simple lack of oxygen, without anyone realizing it. Ventilation wasn't just bad, it was non-existent. Wealthier homes might have small ventilation holes covered with cloth or wooden shutters, but these did little. The poor lived in windowless huts or buildings with just one opening for the door. In winter, that door stayed closed as much as possible to conserve heat. Imagine spending 14 hours straight in a room with 20 other people, a fire, and no fresh air. The carbon monoxide buildup alone could kill you. Night air fears affected daily routines too. People avoided going outside after dark unless absolutely necessary. Evening chores got done quickly. Travelers who arrived at night often had to sleep outside town gates until morning. Even midnight bathroom breaks were risky. Many just used chamber pots indoors rather than brave the dangerous night air. Some towns had laws requiring windows to be shuttered at sunset for public health reasons. The irony is that their solution made the problem worse. By sealing homes so tightly, they concentrated all the actual disease vectors inside. Fleas, lice, and bacteria thrived in the warm, stagnant air. Smoke damaged the lungs made people more susceptible to infections. Their fear of imaginary night air dangers left them vulnerable to real threats lurking in their own homes. Sleeping arrangements reflected these fears too. Beds were often placed as far from windows as possible. Canopy beds with heavy curtains became popular partly because they blocked drafts and bad air. People would sleep fully clothed to protect themselves from nighttime chills they believed caused illness. Some even wore cloth over their mouths as primitive air filters. This superstition persisted for centuries, even during plague outbreaks when corpses piled in the streets. People still feared opening windows more than rotting flesh outside. The wealthy would burn expensive herbs and perfumes to clean the air rather than letting it breathe. Poor families just endured the stench, believing the alternative was worse. The consequences were brutal. Historians estimate medieval city dwellers lost about 10 years of life expectancy compared to rural peasants, partly due to awful indoor air quality. Respiratory infections were leading causes of death. Many mysterious illnesses were probably just chronic oxygen deprivation or smoke inhalation, yet no one connected the dots. They kept blaming the night air rather than their sealed-up homes. And speaking of fears, let's talk about what happened when you got sick. Medieval doctors had some truly creative ways to make your illness worse. If the night air didn't kill you, their treatments certainly would. Feeling under the weather? A medieval doctor might prescribe a potion made from ground-up skulls. Medical knowledge in the Middle Ages was so limited that seeing a doctor often became more dangerous than the illness itself. The humoral theory dominated medicine. The physicians convinced that balancing blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile could cure any ailment. This led to treatments that would make modern doctors shudder. Bloodletting was a go-to solution for everything from headaches to plague. Doctors would slice open veins or apply leeches, sometimes draining pints of blood in a single session. The more serious your condition, the more blood they'd take. Weak from illness, they'd make you weaker by removing what little blood you had left. Iron knives and crude metal cups were used with procedure. With no sterilization beyond a quick wipe on a dirty apron, infections were practically guaranteed. Herbal remedies weren't much safer. Physicians prescribed toxic plants like wolfsbane and hemlock, believing small doses could cure disease. Measurements were guesswork, and many patients died from accidental poisoning. Ground up mummy powder and crushed human skulls were popular ingredients, thought to transfer life force from the dead to the living. If the disease didn't kill you, the cure might. One bad batch of medicine could wipe out an entire village. Surgery was a last resort performed without anesthesia. Patients were held down or knocked unconscious with alcohol, while doctors sawed bones or removed limbs with iron tools. Surgeons worked fast not out of skill, but necessity. The longer the operation took, the more likely you died from shock or blood loss. Bone saws, cauterizing irons, and crude needles were reused without cleaning between patients. Iron knives, bone saws, and prayers. Lots of prayers sums up medieval surgical tools. Childbirth was equally perilous. Midwives had no training in complications. One bad birth, one stuck shoulder, one breech baby, and that was it, without proper hygiene or medical knowledge. Infections killed mothers days after delivery. Newborns died from trivial issues that modern medicine easily prevents. Infant mortality rates were so high that parents often didn't name children until they survived their first year. Doctors couldn't even handle basic injuries properly. A simple cut could go septic and kill you without antibiotics or steroid dressing. Fractured bones often led to amputations rather than proper setting. Wounds were packed with dung or moss to stop bleeding, introducing deadly bacteria. Even tooth extractions frequently caused fatal infections. Your average barber surgeon was more likely to spread disease than cure it. The entire medical system made epidemics worse. When plague struck, doctors prescribed the same useless treatments while wearing beak masks stuffed with herbs that did nothing. They blamed miasmas and planetary alignments rather than fleas and rats. The plague of Athens shows what happened. It wiped out a third of the city while doctors stood helpless. Patients died faster in hospitals than at home due to concentrated filth and disease. Medical education was laughable by modern standards. Physicians trained by reading ancient texts full of errors rather than examining actual patients. Universities taught that the wound could wander around the body, causing hysteria. Autopsies were rare and often performed on rotting corpses weeks after death. Surgeons learned by practicing on dead paupers with no understanding of anatomy. A medieval doctor's diploma was basically a license to kill. Wealth provided no protection either. Kings died from treatments as brutal as those given to peasants. Charles II of England's doctors drained 24 ounces of blood, gave him enemas, and applied hot irons to the skin before he finally expired. Rich patients could afford more treatments, which meant more opportunities for doctors to accidentally kill them. The best medical advice was often to avoid doctors entirely. Survival rates told the grim story. Patients who received no treatment often fared better than those who saw physicians. Hospitals were places you went to die rather than recover. Even minor illnesses became death sentences under medical care. The lucky ones were the poor who couldn't afford a doctor's fees. They at least avoided the bloodletting and toxic potions. And if illness didn't kill you, starvation might. Medieval food shortages turned dinner tables into battlefields where peasants fought just to get a scrap of moldy bread, while doctors bled patients dry. Farmers watched crops fail and livestock die. The next section shows how hunger became another everyday killer in this brutal world. Ever skip a meal? In medieval Europe, that wasn't choice, it was daily life. Peasants woke up wondering if they'd eat at all, not while we complain about skipping lunch. They faced seasons where food simply ran out. The threat of starvation haunted every harvest, every winter, every rainy season that drowned crops. Your modern diet would look like a king's feast compared to their reality. Bread and pottage formed the backbone of peasant meals. When food was available, pottage wasn't some hearty stew, just a thin gruel of whatever grains and vegetables they could scrape together. Imagine eating the same watery oat mixed for weeks, the flavor never changing, the portions shrinking as supplies dwindled. Meat was so rare that most peasants only tasted it a few times a year during festivals. The wealthy gorged themselves on roasted meat, while commoners fought over moldy bread crusts. Crop failures destroyed communities with frightening regularity. One bad summer could mean starvation by winter. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 wiped out millions when cold rains rotted grain across Europe. Peasants ate their seed grain, then their livestock, then tree bark and grass. Some resorted to cannibalism. Historical accounts describe parents eating children and travelers disappearing near starving villages. Survival stripped people down to their most desperate instincts. Malnutrition made everything worse. Weak bodies can fight diseases that modern children shrug off. Scurvy from vitamin deficiencies, left gums bleeding and teeth losing. Rickets bowed children's legs from lack of sunlight and proper nutrition. Workers collapsed in fields from sheer exhaustion and hunger, yet they had to keep laboring. No work meant no food at all. The wealthy stayed healthier not from better medicine, but simply because they ate regularly. Farming methods barely kept pace with populations. Without crop rotation, fields quickly exhausted themselves. A family might only harvest 6 grains for every one planted. Compare that to modern yields of 50 to 1. Droughts baked the hardpack. Floods washed away topsoil. Frost killed sprouts in spring. Every meal represented backbreaking work, under the threat of total loss. The hunger changed how people thought and acted. Food riots erupted when harvests failed. Villagers hoarded scraps and accused neighbors of stealing. Some sold their land for a week's worth of food, dooming themselves to serfdom. Parents abandoned children. They couldn't feed at monastery gates. The psychological toll must have been crushing. Knowing your family's hunger was just one bad season away at all times. Wealthy households wasted obscene amounts of food, while peasants starved. A single noble feast could consume what a village ate in weeks. Leftovers went to hunting dogs rather than the poor. The church preached charity but kept full storehouses. This inequality bred resentment that fueled peasant revolts. Hungry people have nothing left to lose. Even successful harvests brought little security. Up to a third of grain was reserved as seed for next year. Farmers couldn't eat their whole crop without dooming future harvests. Taxes and tithes took another portion before families could feed themselves. Stores were precarious. Mice, rats, and mold ruined precious supplies through winter. Every meal was a calculated risk against future starvation. When desperate, people ate anything. They ground acorns and bark into flour. They boiled leather straps for broth. Famished crowds reportedly ate clay, which swelled in stomachs to create a false sense of fullness before killing them. Some poison plants were eaten knowingly. Better a quick death than slow starvation. The very old and very young died first, their bodies unable to withstand the deprivation. This constant hunger shaped medieval culture profoundly. Religious art depicted food as temptation and gluttony as sin, easy moral for those with full bellies. Folk tales warned of food that turned to ash in greedy mouths. Seasonal festivals centered around the few times. Common people ate well. The fear of famine persisted even in good years, woven into daily life like the hunger pangs themselves. And when food ran out, people turned to desperate measures. Theft became survival. Families abandoned homes to wander as beggars. Some sold themselves into serfdom for regular meals. Others turned to crime, highway robbery or prostitution, just to eat. Starvation didn't just kill bodies. It eroded the bonds holding communities together. The social breakdown could be as devastating as the hunger itself. You think the COVID lockdown was bad? Try living through the Black Death. Within just a few years, this plague wiped out an estimated third of Europe's population. That's not just numbers. That's entire villages gone, cities left half empty, corpses piling up faster than anyone could bury them, while we complain about toilet paper shortages. They faced literal mountains of dead bodies with no one left to dig graves. The plague didn't discriminate. It killed rich and poor alike at terrifying speed. One day you feel fine. The next you develop swollen lymph nodes called buboes in your groin or armpits, then fever, delirium, and death within days. Some versions cause victims to cough up blood before dying even faster. There were no treatments, no cures, just waiting to see if you wake up alive tomorrow. The lucky ones died quickly rather than watching their whole family perish first. Urban areas became death traps. Crowded streets, rat-infested homes, and total lack of sanitation created perfect conditions for plague-bearing fleas to jump from rats to humans. People didn't understand germ theory, so they kept doing all the wrong things, sealing sick people in houses together, throwing waste into streets, and huddling close for comfort. Every human contact became potentially deadly. Some towns lost 80% of their population in months. Quarantines failed spectacularly. Officials tried isolating ships for 40 days, the origin of the word quarantine, but they didn't realize rats could swim ashore. Travel restrictions came too late as the plague raced along trade routes. People fled infected cities, only to carry the disease with them to new areas. The few doctors who didn't flee wore bizarre beak masks filled with herbs that did nothing to stop infection. Their treatments, like bloodletting or rubbing onion paste on buboes, just made dying more uncomfortable. Burying the dead became impossible as death outpaced grave diggers. Mass graves swallowed hundreds of times, sometimes with people buried alive in a rush. Some towns resorted to throwing corpses into rivers or burning piles of bodies. The stench of rotting flesh hung over cities for months. Dogs and rats fed freely on the dead, continuing the cycle of infection. Many survivors developed PTSD from the constant horror around them. The economic collapse was nearly as devastating as the plague itself. With so many workers dead, crops rotted in fields and workshops stood empty. Prices skyrocketed while wages stayed stagnant at first. Later, labor shortages actually improved conditions for peasants who survived. They could demand better pay as lords competed for their work. The whole feudal system began unraveling, as there simply weren't enough people left to maintain it. Social structures collapsed alongside the economy. People abandoned sick relatives. Neighbors turned on each other, and mobs looked for scapegoats. Some blamed Jews, leading to massacres across Europe. Others flagellated themselves in religious frenzies, believing the plague was God's punishment. The church lost credibility as prayers failed to stop deaths, and priests died alongside their flocks. Law enforcement disappeared as officials fled or died. The psychological impact was brutal. Imagine watching nearly everyone you know die within months, with no explanation why some lived and others didn't. Survivors developed superstitions to cope, carrying flowers to ward off bad air, avoiding bathing, which they thought opened towards disease, or drinking molten gold as a cure. The constant presence of death changed art, literature, and attitudes for generations. People partied excessively, preparing for imminent death, or withdrew completely from society. Ironically, the plague did have some positive long-term effects. The labor shortages eventually led to better wages and working conditions for peasants. Overpopulation problems solved themselves. Medical knowledge slowly improved as old practices proved useless. The drop in population reduced pressure on farmland and allowed forests to regrow. Nature essentially hit a giant reset button on medieval society. Some areas recovered surprisingly quickly within a generation or two. Others never regained their pre-plague populations. The trauma lingered in cultural memory for centuries, appearing in art, sayings, and that existential medieval gloom we associate with the period. Every subsequent outbreak kept the fear fresh, the plague returning periodically like an unwelcome guest. And if disease didn't kill you, the law might. Medieval justice made modern punishments look like parking tickets. While the plague ravaged populations, authorities maintained brutal systems of control that could end your life just as quickly as any disease. Public executions became morbid entertainment. Torture was standard procedure, and simple arguments could land you in an Iron Maiden. Ever complained about a traffic ticket? In medieval Europe, your punishment might involve being stretched on a rack until your joints pop. Justice back then wasn't about fairness. It was about making examples of people. Minor theft could cost you a hand. Telling the wrong joke might get you branded. And if you really upset the wrong people, you'd find yourself facing execution methods that would make a horror movie look tame. Public executions were the reality TV of their day. Towns gathered to watch criminals hang, burn, or get drawn and quartered. Sometimes all at once for extra entertainment. The more dramatic the punishment, the better. Authorities believed brutal displays would scare people into behaving. Instead, it just normalized violence. Crowds brought snacks and drinks to watch people die slow, agonizing deaths. Children attended these events like we'd go to a baseball game today. Torture wasn't some shadowy backroom practice. It was standard legal procedure. Courts routinely used tools like thumb screws, the staccato, and iron maidens to extract confessions. The logic was simple. Pain brought truth. It didn't matter if you were innocent. Once the torture started, you confessed to anything just to make it stop. Some devices, like the rack, could permanently disable you before you even reach trial. Judges considered these mutilated confessions perfectly valid evidence, which trials were especially grim. All it took was one neighbor's rumor to land you in front of a tribunal. They'd search your body for this mark, which could be anything from a mole to a freckle, then dunk you in water to see if you floated. Fail the test, and you burn at the stake. The entire process was stacked against you from the start. Most accused witches were poor, elderly women without protection. Their trials weren't about justice, just convenient scapegoats for society's problems. Heresy accusations were equally deadly. Questioning church doctrine to get you burned alive in the town square. Religious courts didn't need physical evidence. A single witness statement was enough to convict you. They'd confiscate your property first, leaving your family homeless, then parade you through the streets before lighting the pyre. These executions sent a clear message: conform or die. Even dead heretics weren't safe. The church sometimes dug up and burned their bones years later for good measure. Class played a huge role in how you were punished. Nobles got quick beheadings with sharp swords. Peasants faced slow hangings with frayed ropes. Drawing and quartering was reserved for traitors. They'd tie you to horses that ripped you apart limb by limb. Some executioners took pride in their work, developing techniques to prolong suffering. One French executioner could keep a man alive through multiple limb removals before finishing the job. The justice system actively encouraged neighbor-to-neighbor accusations. If you reported a crime, you might get a cut of the convicted person's property. This turned communities into nests of paranoia, where petty grudges could become death sentences. Innocent people confessed to impossible crimes just to end torture sessions. Some victims implicated others on their way to execution, creating chains of false accusations that wiped out whole families. Bodily mutilation served as permanent criminal records. Thieves lost hands. Blasphemers had tongues cut out. The law wasn't trying to rehabilitate. It wanted people to wear their crimes literally on their sleeves. These punishments made surviving nearly impossible when manual labor was your only income source. Many mutilated criminals begged until starvation or exposure finished what the court started. Even kids weren't safe. Adolescents faced adult punishments, including execution. One 14th century English case records a 10-year-old hanged for stealing bread. The concept of juvenile justice didn't exist. If you were big enough to reach the crime, you were old enough to die for it. Some executioners used special child-sized gallows to accommodate younger offenders. The system's randomness was its greatest terror. One judge might fine you for a crime that would get you hanged elsewhere. Local lords often settled personal vendettas through courts. Without standardized laws, your fate depended entirely on who you angered and where you lived. It wasn't justice, just organized violence with thin legal veneer. And if the law didn't kill you, your neighbors might. Medieval villages ran on gossip and suspicion, where a sideways glance could mark you as the next witch or heretic, while judges handed down brutal sentences. Ordinary people eagerly turned on each other to avoid becoming targets themselves. Ever had a noisy neighbor? In medieval Europe, that minor annoyance could get you burned at the stake. Communities back then were pressure cookers of suspicion, where every odd behavior became potential evidence of witchcraft. Your neighbor's cow died? Must be your fault. Someone got sick after you argued? Clearly you cursed them. People didn't just live near each other. They watched each other constantly for signs of heresy or sorcery. Gossip turned deadly fast. A careless comment about someone's bad harvest could spiral into a witchcraft accusation within days. Villagers relied on oral rumors because most couldn't read. So stories mutated with each temple. That woman who knew too much about herbs, suddenly she's brewing potions. The old man who lived alone, obviously consorting with thieves. Communities protected their own by targeting outsiders first. The poor, the disabled, anyone who didn't fit in. Family feuds lasted generations, with grudges passed down like heirlooms. A dispute over a stolen chicken could lead to decades of retaliatory violence. Land boundaries created endless conflicts. Since marked fences were rare and memories were long, if your great-grandfather wronged someone, their descendants might still be waiting to settle the score. These feuds drained entire villages, with families abandoning crops to guard against night raids or sabotage. Witch hunts preyed on this paranoia. During hard times, failed harvests, plagues, people needed someone to blame. Elderly women were easy targets, especially if they lived alone or had unusual skills like midwifery. Accusers often had personal stakes: envy of neighbors' better crops, jealousy over marriage proposals, or plain old revenge. Trial methods ensured convictions. The water test: if you floated when dunked, you were guilty. If you sank and drowned, you were innocent, just dead. Mob justice bypassed courts entirely. If enough people decided you were troubled, they'd handle it themselves. A group might drag you from your home, beat you, or drive you out of town without any formal charges. Officials often looked the other way, especially if the accused was unpopular. Some victims mysteriously disappeared after community meetings. Others faced public shaming, being paraded through streets while neighbors threw rotten food and stones. Trust didn't come easily. You couldn't confide in anyone without risking betrayal. Even family members turned on each other to save themselves. Children testified against parents under pressure. Husbands accused wives to avoid being implicated. The church encouraged this, teaching that rooting out evil trumped loyalty. Spies were everywhere. Someone was always listening at windows or lurking near conversations. The poor suffered most. Wealthy families could bribe officials or flee to cities when accusations flew. Peasants had no protection. A single bad harvest might force you to borrow from a neighbor, putting you in their debt and at their mercy. If they later accused you of witchcraft, no one would defend you. Land-hungry neighbors sometimes use accusations to seize property from vulnerable families. Isolation was no escape either. Living apart from the village made you more suspicious. Traveling merchants faced constant scrutiny. Any unfamiliar custom or accent could spark rumors. Solitary farmers were suspected of hiding dark practices. Even pious behavior backfired. Too much church attendance might mean you were compensating for secret sins. The stress wore people down. Constant watchfulness frayed nerves. Villages developed bizarre superstitions to cope, avoiding certain paths at night, nailing charms to doors, refusing to speak names of the dead. People second-guessed every action. Was that sickness natural or a curse? Did that storm come because someone angered God? Normal misfortunes became proof of supernatural threats. Some fought back carefully. Cunning folk offered counter-charms against witchcraft, walking a fine line between helping and becoming targets themselves. A few bold individuals protected accused neighbors. Though this risked becoming accomplices, most just kept their heads down, praying not to attract attention. Speaking up for someone could mean joining them on the pyre. And if your neighbors didn't kill you, your job might. Medieval work wasn't just hard, it was deadly by design. While you worried about witchcraft accusations, your daily labor slowly broke your body in ways just as cruel as any execution. The fields and workshops had dangers that made neighborly disputes seem mild by comparison. Ever complained about a long shift? Medieval peasants worked from sunrise to sunset, every single day of the year. There were no weekends, no sick days, just endless labor under the watchful eye of the Lord who owned the land and everything on it. Serfs weren't employees. They were property, bound to the soil they worked until they died. The closest thing to a break was church-mandated feast days. But even then, you still had to tend livestock or put out fires. Harvest season was pure brutality. You'd work 16-hour days in scorching heat or freezing rain, cutting grain with sickles that gave you blisters the size of coins. A single acre could take days to harvest by hand, and most peasants worked 10 to 15 acres just to meet quotas. The work never stopped. After bringing in crops, you thresh, winnow, and grind grain until your hands cramped. Winter wasn't restful either. You chop wood, repair tools, and haul manure in bitter cold. Your lord might loan you a plow horse if you were lucky, but most pulled the plow themselves like beasts of burden. Life expectancy for laborers hovered around 35 years. Constant strain destroyed joints. Archaeologists find peasant skeletons with spinal deformities from bending over fields for decades. Malnutrition made bones brittle, so falls often meant broken hips that never healed properly. The average peasant looked decades older than their actual age from sun damage and repetitive stress injuries. Many died from simple infections that modern antibiotics would cure in days. Heart attacks struck young from years of overexertion on starvation rations. Injuries were expected, not accidental. Sides slipped and sliced legs. Millstones crushed fingers. Plowshares gashed feet. There were no doctors for peasants, just poultices made of whatever weeds grew nearby. A minor cut could turn septic and kill you in weeks. Broken limbs often healed crooked, leaving permanent disabilities. Still, you had to work through the pain. No labor meant no food. Lords didn't care if you were injured. Your family still owed the same taxes and tithes. Some serfs worked themselves to literal death just to avoid the even worse fate of homelessness. Child labor started as soon as you could walk. Toddlers chased birds from fields. 6-year-olds minded livestock in wolf-infested woods. By 10, you worked the same hours as adults, just with half the food portion. Many children died in farm accidents, drowning in ponds, getting trampled by oxen, or falling from hay logs. Parents couldn't afford to leave. They needed the next kid to start working immediately. The idea of a childhood simply didn't exist, and one bad harvest meant starvation for everyone. The feudal system trapped you in the cycle. Your lord decided when you planted, what crops you grew, and took most of the yield. Better harvest just meant higher taxes next year. Attempting to flee made you an outlaw. Other villages would turn you in for bounty. Marriage required the lord's permission, sometimes with a fee. Even in death, your family owed a harrier, your best animal or tool, just to keep farming your miserable plot. Protest meant public flogging both ways. Weather was your personal nemesis. Too much rain rotted seeds and ground. Drought baked fields to dust. A single hailstorm could wipe out months of work overnight. You watched clouds like a gambler watches dice, knowing your family's survival depended entirely on forces you couldn't control. The so-called Little Ice Age, starting in the 1300s, made everything worse. Cold summers killed crops, leading to famines where peasants ate bark and boiled leather shoes. No one understood climate change. They just suffered its effects. Disease preyed on exhausted bodies. Weakened immune systems turned colds into pneumonia. Moldy grain caused gangrenous ergotism. Constant contact with humans and animal waste spread dysentery. Your children might survive measles only to die from malnutrition as fever stole their appetite. Medicine was useless. Village wise women prescribed charms and herbs that did nothing. Doctors were for the rich, and even their cures often made things worse. Winter was nature's gauntlet. You'd slaughter most animals in autumn since you couldn't feed them, then ration salted meat that barely lasted until spring. Frozen ground made gathering firewood deadly. Many peasants lost fingers or toes to frostbite during desperate searches for kindling. Your hovel offered little shelter. Wind whistled through cracks, and the central hearth filled the room with smoke. Entire families slept piled together like dogs, sharing body heat as their breath froze on blankets. Starvation killed more in February than any other month. There was no retirement. Grandparents worked until they collapsed in the fields. The truly crippled begged at church doors until exposed with finished moth. Death was often a relief from the unending grind. The few who reached old age had bodies so broken they could barely walk. Twisted spines from decades of bending. Hands clawed into permanent grips from clutching tools. Lungs ruined by years of inhaling chaff dust. Their only reward for surviving was watching their children start the same hopeless cycle. And if work didn't kill you, the weather might. Medieval Europe's climate was like a gambler's nightmare. Always rolling snake eyes when peasants needed sevens. 1 year of drought could wipe out entire villages, leaving the survivors to face winter with empty stomachs and no seed for next year's plant. The elements didn't just inconvenience people, it erased them. ever curse a rainy day? In medieval Europe. Complaining about weather wasn't small talk. It was survival. One bad season could wipe out entire villages. Farmers watched skies like gamblers watch dice, knowing their lives depended on the crops they couldn't control, while we checked weather apps for weekend plans. They prayed against rains that drowned seeds or droughts that baked fields to dust. Nature didn't just inconvenience them, it erased them. The Little Ice Age reshaped medieval life, starting in the 1300s. Summers got shorter, winters turned brutal, and frosts came unexpectedly. Grapes stopped growing in England. Alpine villages disappeared under glaciers. Crops failed year after year. People blamed curses or divine punishment when their real enemy was something they couldn't even understand. Climate change. The cooling wasn't gradual either. Some years brought heat waves. Others brought snow in July. Farmers couldn't adapt because every season became a gamble. Droughts baked the life out of soil. Dry spells lasting weeks cracked open the earth, choking seedlings before they could grow. Water sources shrank to muddy puddles shared with livestock. Rivers that usually irrigated fields became pathetic trickles. Peasants tried digging deeper wells, but their crude tools couldn't reach far enough. Starvation followed within months. Parents gave children portions meant for songbirds while praying for rain that might never come. But when rains arrived, they often came too hard. Flash floods washed away topsoil that took generations to build. Low-lying villages vanished overnight as rivers overflowed. Grain stores rotted in flooded cellars. Roads became impassable swamps, cutting off trade routes. The few surviving crops might sprout mold that caused gangrenous ergotism, a condition where limbs turned black and fell off. There was no winning with medieval weather. Either it didn't come, or it came like a weapon. Winter was nature's executioner. The coldest months meant choosing between freezing or suffocating. Sealing homes tight trapped smoke from constant fires, but opening windows invited deadly drafts. Livestock died in droves, forcing families to slaughter most animals in autumn. Any meat not preserved with precious salt spoiled by midwinter. Trees cracked from cold, making firewood scarce. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes during desperate searches for kindling. February was the cruelest month. Empty stomachs, empty stores, and still months until spring. Unpredictable frosts were just as deadly as winter. A single cold night in spring could kill fruit blossoms, dooming orchards for the year. Peasants tried burning bonfires to protect vineyards, but sudden temperature drops still wiped out entire harvests. Late frost in autumn ruined crops, almost ready for harvest. There was no meteorological warning system, just waking up to fields of blackened, frozen plants and knowing hunger would follow. The wealthy suffered less, but not much. Lords could import some grain, but bad weather raised prices exponentially. Even castle stores ran low during prolonged famines. Their solution? Tax peasants harder to compensate for lower yields. A vicious cycle merged. Poor weather meant poor harvest, meant harsher taxes, meant fewer resources to survive the next poor harvest. The rich ate slightly better while the poor ate bark, but everyone's margin for error shrank each year. Weather shaped daily routines down to the hour. Farmers rose before dawn to maximize daylight. Since clouds could roll in by noon, they planted crops in staggered patches. If one failed, others might survive. Communities developed folk signs to predict weather, like red skies at night or aching joints before storms. None worked reliably, but people clung to any illusion of control when facing forces that could erase their existence. Climatic disasters triggered eerily familiar responses. Authorities blamed witches for bad weather, leading to mass executions during famines. Some towns enacted early disaster relief by forcing farmers to share grain stores until those ran out too. People migrated en masse following weather patterns, becoming refugees in neighboring regions already struggling to feed their own. Sound familiar? Humans haven't changed much when facing environmental collapse. The psychological toll is immense. Chronic uncertainty bred superstition and fanaticism. Some turned to extreme religious flagellation, believing pain might appease whatever forces control the weather. Others abandoned farms to wander as beggars. Many starved passively, too drained by hunger to even search for food. You could measure a village's desperation by how many were eating boiled leather or clay by winter's end. And if the weather didn't kill you, your diet might. Medieval meals weren't just bland. They were nutritional Russian roulette. While we fuss over gluten and macros, peasants hoped their bread wasn't secretly poisoning them or their gruel had enough nutrients to last another week. Every bite carried risks modern eaters can't comprehend. Ever tried a fad diet? Medieval peasants would have killed for that kind of variety. Their daily meal plan was simple. Bread for breakfast, bread for lunch, and if they were lucky, slightly different bread for dinner. The peasant diet wasn't just boring. It was a slow-motion nutritional crisis that left entire generations stunted and sickly. While we obsess over protein intake and vitamin supplements, they hoped their food wasn't actively poisoning them. Bread wasn't the artisanal, gluten-free kind you're imagining. This was dense, coarse stuff made from whatever grain survived the last harvest, usually rye or barley. It was stale, hard, and reportedly about as exciting as the dirt it was baked in the air. Worse, it often contained unwanted extras, weevils, mold, or even sawdust when millers cheated customers. You'd break a tooth on the grit left from primitive milling stones. The dark loaves looked and tasted like baked mud, but they were still the foundation of survival. The pottage that accompanied this bread was just grain boiled into a sad, gray glue. Sometimes they threw in whatever wilted greens grew nearby, nettles, leeks, or cabbage if they were feeling fancy. Meat appeared maybe a few times a year on feast days. Eggs were precious currency, often sold to pay taxes rather than eaten. Cheese was a rare luxury. Peasants lived in a constant state of protein deficiency, their muscles wasting even as they performed backbreaking labor. Malnutrition reshaped their bodies. Archaeologists find peasant skeletons with stunted growth, bone lesions from vitamin deficiencies, and teeth worn down from chewing gritty bread. Scurvy was rampant despite people living surrounded by fields. They lacked fresh fruits year-round. Children grew up with rickets, their legs bowing under the weight of their own malnourished bodies. Adults developed goiters from iodine deficiency. Simple wounds wouldn't heal because their bodies lacked the nutrients to repair themselves. Feast days offered brief relief. A Christmas meal might include a scrap of salted pork or a chicken leg shared between an entire family. May Day celebrations featured slightly better bread, maybe even with honey, but these were fleeting moments in an otherwise grinding cycle of hunger. After the feast came the reckoning. Empty stores and the grim knowledge that better food wouldn't appear again for months. Food storage was a constant battle. Grain spoiled quickly in damp conditions, turning into a breeding ground for deadly molds like ergot, which caused hallucinations and gangrene. Smoked meats grew rancid by spring. Vegetables stored in cold cellars often froze and became inedible. Peasants drank wheat beer not because they liked it, but because it lasted longer than water and provided some calories. Even this was risky. Poorly brewed batches could cause poisoning. The wealthy ate better, but not by much. Nobles consumed more meat, but their diets lacked variety too. They spiced rotten meat with expensive seasonings to mask the taste. Their bread was whiter, but still nutritionally empty. Even kings suffered from gout and tooth decay from unbalanced diets. The only real difference? When famine hit, the rich could buy or steal food from others. Peasants just starved. Crop failure turned this already precarious situation deadly. A bad harvest meant bread disappeared entirely. People ate famine foods, acorns ground into bitter flour, tree bark boiled into slime, leather belts stewed for hours. Some dug up frozen turnips from winter fields, hoping to find something edible under the frost. Stories tell of parents eating their children's portions, then eating their children when madness set in. The line between survival and atrocity blurred when hunger gripped a village. Seasonal shifts brought different miseries. Spring meant foraging for barely edible wild plants, while waiting for new crops. Summer was backbreaking labor with empty stomachs until harvest time. Autumn brought the stress of preserving whatever meager yield they managed. Winter was pure endurance, watching supplies dwindle day by day. There was no time when food wasn't a constant, gnawing worry. And if the diet didn't kill you, the water might. Medieval drinking sources were essentially biological weapons, contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, and whatever else washed into streams. Rivers near towns functioned as open sewers. Wells were often dug too close to the stream. Clear water from a forest spring might look clean, but still carry parasites. Your choice was dehydration or dysentery, with no good options in between. Ever turned down tap water? In medieval Europe, drinking water was like playing Russian roulette with your stomach. Every gulp might be your last. Streams near villages doubled as sewers, filled with animal carcasses and human waste. Wells often sat a few feet from latrines, creating a neat little contamination loop. People didn't avoid water because they were picky. They avoided it because dysentery could kill you faster than the plague. Ale became the safer choice, which tells you everything. The brewing process boiled water, killing some pathogens. Kids drank small beer with low alcohol content because it was cleaner than well water. Imagine a world where giving children beer was a responsible choice. Even then, ale wasn't perfect. Poor brews could make you sick, and heavy drinking caused other problems. But when the alternative was shitting yourself to death, people took their chances with alcoholism. Cities were death traps when it came to water. Streets flowed with runoff from butcher shops, tanneries, and chamber pots dumped from upper windows. Rain washed this cocktail into public systems. London's River Thames was basically an open sewer teeming with waste. Yet people still drank them. Waterborne diseases like cholera spread rapidly, wiping out families before they even knew what hit them. There were no water filters, no purification tablets, just luck and a strong constitution. Rural areas weren't much better. A clear forest spring might hide parasites. Farm ponds stagnated with algae and animal dung. Even stored water grew dangerous quickly. Barrels bred bacteria without proper cleaning. Dehydration tempted people to drink anyway, leading to vicious cycles of thirst and violent illness. Some tried straining water through cloth or letting it settle, but these methods did nothing against microscopic threats. Boiling water helped, but fuel was precious. Peasants couldn't waste firewood just to make drinking water safer. Some monasteries boiled water from medicinal teas, but this was rare. Most people drank whatever was closest, then prayed they wouldn't get sick. Dysentery killed slowly, draining victims of fluids until they withered away. Cholera worked faster, sometimes killing within hours of the first symptom. Both left streets littered with bodies during outbreaks. The wealthy weren't immune either. Castles had better access to clean springs, but stagnant moats bred mosquitoes carrying malaria. Wine was safer than water, but only the rich could afford to drink it daily. Even they suffered from waterborne illnesses when supplies ran low during sieges or droughts. The difference was their ability to flee outbreaks. Peasants stayed and died where they stood. Contaminated water caused long-term damage beyond immediate death. Chronic diarrhea meant malnutrition, as people lost nutrients faster than they could eat. Waterborne parasites caused internal damage over years. Some villages saw stunted growth in children who survived repeated infections. The constant threat affected mental health too. Imagine never knowing if your next drink would be your last. Little was done to solve the problem because no one understood it. People blamed bad air or divine punishment rather than invisible organisms. Some towns tried regulating waste disposal, but enforcement was weak. A few cities built primitive sewers, but these often emptied right back into drinking sources downstream. Efforts to dig deeper wells helped until the water table dropped too low. Bathing ironically became dangerous too. Public bathhouses spread skin diseases rapidly. Some believe hot water opened pores to plague, so people avoided washing entirely. The result? Fleas and lice thrived in grimy conditions while distrust of clean water persisted. It was a lose-lose situation. Be dirty and itchy or bathe in disinfection. Brewers became unlikely public health heroes by default. Their ale fed entire towns when water was unsafe. Monasteries brewed beer not just for profit, but as a service to communities. Some lords even mandated breweries as part of village infrastructure. This didn't stop alcoholism or drunken violence, but it slightly improved survival odds during outbreaks. Water shortages made everything worse. Droughts forced people to drink from contaminated sources they'd normally avoid. Winter froze streams, leaving only stagnant ice that melted into foul cellars. Even gathering water was dangerous. Women fetching from rivers sometimes drowned or were attacked. Wells collapsed from those drawing buckets. Nothing about water access was simple or safe. And if water didn't kill you, your clothes might. Medieval fashion had its own special brand of torture. Itchy fabrics, lead-based makeup, and shoes that deformed feet, while water threatened your inside. Clothing attacked your exterior in ways that made modern fast fashion look downright comfortable. Ever forgotten deodorant? In medieval Europe, everyone reeked all the time. Bathing was a rare event, maybe once a month if you were wealthy, once a year if you were poor. Soap existed but was a luxury item most couldn't afford. People didn't just embody odor. They fermented in their own grime for weeks on end. The concept of daily showers would have seemed as absurd as flying to the moon. The streets smelled worse than the people. Chamber pots got emptied directly onto roads with the contents baked in the sun. Butchers dumped animal guts in alleys. Tanners soaked hides in urine-filled vats near water sources. There were no garbage trucks. Everything from rotten food to dead animals got tossed outside and left to rot. Walking through town meant wading through a slurry of mud, feces, and decaying waste. The stench clung to clothes and hair long after you went indoors. Wealthy folks tried masking the smell with perfumes. They carried pomanders, decorated balls filled with herbs and spices, to hold under their noses outdoors. But these just created a competing stink of clothes and roses battling the sewage. Poor people had no such luxuries. They got used to the smell or tie cloth over their faces during worst offenses. Some just accepted that life smelled terrible and moved on. Homes weren't safe havens from the stench. Damp straw bedding bread mold. Cooking smoke permeated every surface. Most families kept livestock indoors at night, so animal dung added to the olfactory assault. Flea-infested rugs and never-washed curtains completed the bouquet. Windows stayed shut against bad air, trapping all these scents inside to mingle and intensify. Personal hygiene practices would horrify modern sensibilities. People rarely washed their hands, even before meals or after using the bathroom. Teeth got wiped with cloth instead of brush. Hair was combed to remove lice, but seldom washed, just covered with caps or headdresses. The rich powdered wigs later became popular partly to hide greasy, unwashed scalps. Underarms went unshaved and undeodorized, becoming breeding grounds for bacteria. Clothing absorbed these odors permanently. Wool garments might get beaten clean in a river once annually, but they never lost their funk. Leather shoes molded to feet that never saw soap. Undergarments were reused for weeks without washing. When clothes finally became unbearable, they were burned rather than cleaned. The wealthiest could afford perfumed linen shifts change occasionally, but even these quickly took on bodily odors. The concept of private bathrooms didn't exist. Public latrines emptied directly into moats or rivers. The same water sources people drank from. Shared outhouses had no ventilation and rarely got cleaned. Some castles had gargoyles that dropped waste straight into the moat below. Noble visitors sometimes fell to their deaths in rotten toilet seats. Privacy wasn't concerned. Most people relieved themselves wherever convenient. Seasonal changes intensified the stink. Summer heat turned streets into open sewers buzzing with flies. Winter cold meant tightly sealed homes trapping all odors inside. Spring rains washed wasteful streets into drinking wells. Autumn brought rotting harvests, waste piled near homes. There was never a fresh air season, just varying degrees of foulness. Diseases flourished in these conditions. Typhus spread via body like thriving in unwashed clothes. Dysentery raged through communities drinking contaminated water. Skin infections festered in layers of dirt and sweat. Respiratory illnesses spread fastest in homes choked with smoke and mold. Ironically, the wealthy who could afford baths sometimes got sick more often. Communal bathhouses spread disease rapidly through shared water. Children suffered worse from filth. Infants sat in feces soaked swaddling for hours. Toddlers played in streets full of waste. Older kids worked with animals all day, then slept in the same clothes. Schools had no hand-washing stations. Many children died from preventable infections that modern hygiene would stop easily. Those who survived grew up thinking constant itching and rashes were normal. The psychological toll went unacknowledged. People adapted to the stench, but never fully adjusted. Chronic discomfort from dirty skin and crawling life's war on mental health. Social interactions were tinged with revulsion. Everyone smelled each other's breath and body odor constantly. Romance must have required significant olfactory forgiveness. Personal dignity suffered when basic cleanliness was unattainable. Ironically, some feared bathing as unhealthy. Doctors warned that water could carry disease from skin pools. Many believed dirt formed a protective layer against illness. The concept of germs didn't exist, just bad humors and miasmas. When the Black Death hit, terrified people stopped washing entirely, thinking it made them vulnerable. This only helped fleas, and lice spread plague faster. And if the smell didn't kill you, the noise might. Medieval cities never knew silence. Just constant clanging, shouting, and animal noises from dawn until exhaustion took over. The concept of quiet hours wouldn't emerge for centuries. Sleep came in stolen fragments between drunken brawls, night watchmen's calls, and pre-dawn market setups. Peaceful rest was yet another modern luxury medieval folks did without. Ever complain about city noise? Medieval streets never stopped screaming, from dawn till exhaustion took over. You'd hear blacksmiths pounding metal, vendors shouting prices, animals screeching, and night watchmen bellowing the hours. There was no escape, just relentless noise that made our modern traffic jam sound peaceful. If you think your neighbor's lawnmower is annoying, imagine trying to sleep through iron hammers clanging before sunrise. Blacksmiths worked from first light, their forges spitting out a steady rhythm of clanks and hisses. The sound carried for blocks, bouncing off stone walls with no soft surfaces to absorb it. Farriers shaping horseshoes, armorers beating out breastplates, locksmiths fitting iron hinges. Each strike echoed like a bell tolling inside your skull. The rich could live farther from workshops, but even their estates weren't safe when the king needed a new sword. Street vendors treated every public space like a marketplace. Bakers bellowed about fresh loaves. Fishmongers yelled over each other to advertise the day's catch. Water sellers clanged cups together like human alarm clocks. There were no business hours. Just an endless competition to be the loudest. Windows couldn't block the noise, so even indoors you'd hear every fresh eel and bread a penny until nightfall. And then the ale sellers took over. Animals added their own soundtrack. Pigs rooted through garbage in the streets, squealing when kicked aside. Chickens squawked from backyard coops. Horses clomped on cobblestones, their iron shoes sparking against stone. Stray dogs fought over scraps, howling through the night. Wealthy households kept hunting dogs that bayed at shadows. The only quiet animals were the cats, too busy hunting rats to make noise. Night brought no relief. Watchmen patrolled until dawn, shouting the hour and calling out weather warnings. Their footsteps scraped against gravel outside your window. Drunk brawlers stumbled from taverns, singing off-key ballads. The occasional scream of a robbery victim cut through the dark. If you managed to sleep through that, the pre-dawn market carts would rattle you awake. The concept of sleeping in didn't exist when the blacksmith started at sunrise. Children grew up in this constant and babies wailed through the noise, learning early that silence wasn't optional. Kids played in streets full of clattering carts and barking dogs. Schools held lessons amid the chaos, teachers shouting over hammering from nearby workshops. There was no such thing as a quiet place to study or think, just varying volumes of commotion. The wealthy suffered too. Castles amplified sounds of their stone walls and vaulted ceilings. Servants clanged pots in kitchens. Messengers ran through halls with urgent news. Nighttime feasts meant minstrels playing lutes and drunk nobles belting drinking songs until curfew. Even the rich couldn't buy silence, just slightly better noise. Industrial sounds never stopped. Mills ground grain with massive stones that rumbled like earthquakes. Tanners beat hides with wooden mallets. Carpenters sawed planks in rhythmic shrieks. Windmills creaked like giant rusted hinges. There were no earplugs, no soundproofing. Just raw exposure to noise levels that would violate modern workplace safety laws. Silence became mythical. Monasteries chased it with strict quiet rules. But even they had chanting monks and clanging bells. Farmers far from cities still herd livestock and rushing rivers. The closest thing to peace was exhaustion. When your body finally shut down from sheer fatigue, people adapted to the noise. but their nerves never did. Chronic stress from constant sound was inevitable. Headaches, irritability, and sleep deprivation were just part of life. Some turned to alcohol to dull their senses. Others developed habits like teeth grinding or nail biting. The human body wasn't built for endless noise, but medieval life demanded tolerance. Religious folks called silence golden because it was so rare. Ordinary people cherished moments when storms muffled street sounds or holidays paused work. But true quiet didn't exist, just temporary dips in volume before the chaos returned. Even forests had chirping birds, rustling leaves. The world refused to shut up. And if the noise didn't kill you, the isolation might. Medieval villages would feel like lonely islands, cut off from the world by bad roads and bandit-filled forests. News traveled slowly if at all, leaving people starved for information. When you did hear from outsiders, it was usually bad news, plagues, wars, or tax collectors. Your closest neighbors might be the only humans you saw for months. Ever felt isolated? In medieval Europe, your entire world might stretch only as far as you could walk in a day. Villages were islands cut off by dense forests and bandit-filled roads. The nearest town could be a dangerous 3-day journey away, but the muddy paths would wash out first. You weren't just disconnected from the wider world. You were trapped in your own little bubble of superstition and rumor. The global community we take for granted, that didn't exist. Your neighbors were your entire universe. News traveled at the speed of a limping donkey. Important events might take months to reach your village, if they arrived at all. A king's death? You'd find out after the crowning of a successor. War breaking out? You'd only know when soldiers came demanding supplies. Without regular postal systems or newspapers, information arrived distorted through endless retelling. A simple border skirmish 3 counties away might transform into an invading army of monsters by the time it reached your ears. The isolation bred strange beliefs. Villagers explained natural events through stories passed down for generations. That lightning strike? Obviously God's punishment. The well drying up? Clearly witches at work. Without outside perspective, every misfortune needed a supernatural cause. Traveling merchants brought news from other places. But who knew if they could be trusted? Their stories might be lies to sell more goods. Better to stick with what your grandparents taught you. Strangers weren't welcomed. They were interrogated. Visitors stood out instantly in small villages where everyone knew each other's business. Travelers might bring valuable goods, but they could also bring trouble. That harmless peddler could be a thief casing your home. That wandering preacher might spread dangerous ideas. Some villages forced outsiders to leave before sundown, fearing what they might do in the cover of darkness. Hospitality existed, but suspicion usually won. Disease made isolation worse. When plagues hit, villages often walled themselves off entirely. Any stranger approaching might as well wear a sign saying "Death Bringer." Fear turned reasonable caution into outright paranoia. Some places barred all visitors for years during outbreaks, surviving on whatever they could grow locally. The world beyond became a terrifying mystery, best avoided at all costs. The lack of connection stunted knowledge. New farming techniques took decades to spread. Medical advances might never reach your area. Even simple innovations like better plow designs could bypass entire regions for generations. People did things the old way because that's all they knew. Progress crawled at a snail's pace when each village had to reinvent everything independently. Children grew up knowing nothing beyond their fields. The village boundaries marked the edge of their mental map. London, Rome, might as well be mythical places. Geographic ignorance wasn't stupidity. It was enforced by circumstance. Most would live and die without ever seeing a city. Books didn't exist to show them the wider world. Even maps were rare and often wildly inaccurate. The isolation affected language too. Regional dialects diverged so much that travelers from different areas might barely understand each other. Accents thickened without outside influence. Some villages developed their own unique words that confused people from just a few miles away. The concept of a standardized language was centuries away. Entertainment stayed hyperlocal as well. The same handful of stories got retold around fires for generations. A traveling minstrel song became legendary events, eagerly memorized and repeated for years after. Village dances followed the same steps your great-grandparents had used. Without fresh influences, culture stagnated in pleasant but predictable patterns. The calendar became your only connection to the outside world. Church feast days provided rare occasions when news might trickle in from priests or pilgrims. Markets brought bits of information, along with turnips and chickens. These events were lifelines in an otherwise closed existence. Missing them meant falling further into isolation. Yet this isolation created tight communities. Everyone relied on each other for survival. Neighbors weren't just neighbors. They were your emergency food supply, your child care, your protection. Bonds ran deep when you knew you'd spend your entire life beside the same 100 people. The loneliness of modern life didn't exist. You were never alone, just severely limited in who you could interact with. And if the isolation didn't kill you, the boredom might. With no outside stimulation, village life followed the same dull routines year after year. Work dominated daylight hours, and evenings offered little diversion beyond staring at firelight. The rare traveling performer became a major event. Children played with the same sticks and stones their ancestors had. Time moved slowly when every day repeated the last. Ever been bored? Medieval peasants had it worse than your slowest workday. Entertainment wasn't just scarce. It barely existed. Between dawn to dusk labor and survival chores, free time meant collapsing exhausted into your flea-ridden straw bed. Forget Netflix. These folks considered staring at the fire an evening activity. Festivals were the Super Bowl of medieval fun, but they only came a few times a year tied to religious holidays. Imagine waiting months just to watch some traveling acrobats and eat slightly better food. Villagers crammed a year's worth of excitement into these brief breaks, drinking, dancing, and flirting until a church bell struck curfew. Then it was back to grinding poverty until the next thank you party. Storytellers were rock stars who showed up unpredictably like human podcasts. A wandering minstrel might arrive once a year if you were lucky, trading song for a meal and a place to sleep. His stories, recycled from town to town, became your only connection to the outside world. Kids memorized every word because that tale about King Arthur was the only entertainment they'd get for months. Leisure time didn't really exist in how we understand it. That hour between finishing field work and passing out wasn't free time. It was just less work time. Peasants might whittle wood or mend tools by firelight, which wasn't relaxing so much as slightly less exhausting than daytime labor. The concept of hobbies wouldn't emerge for centuries. Kids made their own fun with whatever was lying around. Sticks became swords. Stones became game pieces. Dirt was the ultimate crafting material. Their toys were rocks, animal bones. If they were really lucky, a deflated pig bladder to kick around. No playground, no toy shops, just endless improvisation with whatever wasn't actively trying to kill them. Music existed if someone had a flute carved from a bone or knew 3 chords on a homemade lute. Village dances were just people stomping in circles to the same 3 repetitive tunes. The rhythm section was your neighbor clapping offbeat. No amplifiers, no set list, just a drunk farmer attempting to sing while missing half the notes. Games were brutal by modern standards. Wrestling matches left participants bleeding. Archery contests used live targets. Even board games involved gambling with little food or coins people had. Chess existed for nobles, but peasants played versions where the rules changed depending on who was winning. There were no referees, just escalating arguments that sometimes ended in actual stabbings. The church controlled most official entertainment options. Religious plays recycled the same Bible stories annually with the same terrible acting. Processions let you walk in circles holding candles. Feast days meant marginally better food if the harvest was good. Even these events came with sermons about not enjoying yourself too much. Fun was always conditional on behaving piously first. Adults had few ways to unwind after work. Ale was a primary leisure activity, consumed in staggering quantities because there wasn't much else to do. Taverns were just someone's dirt floor house with worse life. Drinking games involved remembering which of your 3 anecdotes you hadn't told yet tonight. The most common pastime was staring into the middle distance while slowly getting drunk. Romantic relationships weren't much of a distraction either. Courting involved chaperone visits where you mostly discussed property use. Flirting meant complimenting someone's ability to churn butter. Weddings were the closest thing to excitement. But even those just recycled the same handful of traditions before everyone got too drunk to stand. Seasonal changes brought mild variety. Spring meant watching lambs grow. Summer offered slightly longer evenings to stare at fires. Autumn featured the thrilling spectacle of grain being ground into flour. Winter was just darkness and trying not to freeze to death. Each season cycled through the same limited activities, like nature's boring playlist. The wealthy weren't much better off. Their idea of fun was hunting animals or watching jesters repeat the same tired jokes. Board games took days to complete because the rules were needlessly complicated. Even their parties mostly involved sitting stiffly, while musicians played the same three songs slightly out of tune. Money couldn't buy good entertainment, just more expensive versions of mediocrity. Crafts provided one of the few creative outlets. Women might embroider the same patterns their grandmothers taught them. Men carved the same simple figures they'd made since childhood. Everything practical doubled as decoration, because nobody had time for pure art. That butter knife, it's now fancy, because it has one zigzag carved in the hand. Time moved differently without distraction. An hour felt like forever when your entertainment was watching candle wax drip. Kids measured weeks by how many times they played the same stick game. Adults marked years by repetitions of the same three festivals. The present stretched endlessly while the past and future blurred together into one unchanging cycle. Yet people adapted to this boredom in ways we can't imagine. They found meaning in repetitive tasks. They cherished tiny variations in routine. A new song or a different bread recipe counted as major excitement. Their capacity to endure monotony puts our restless scrolling to shame. They could literally stare at walls for hours without going insane. And if boredom didn't kill you, the religion might. Medieval faith wasn't just Sunday worship. It was an all-consuming force that dictated every aspect of life. Your eternal soul hung in the balance of every minor decision. Skip church once, and suddenly you're the village heretic facing down an angry mob with torches. Belief wasn't optional. It was mandatory survival. Ever skipped church? In medieval Europe, that wasn't just rudeness. It was a fast path to eternal damnation. The Catholic Church didn't just influence daily life. It controlled it completely, from the moment you were baptized to the second you choked out your last confession. This was a religion as we know it today. It was an all-encompassing system of power that dictated what you ate, when you worked, and who you could sleep with. And if you stepped out of line, they had special torture chambers just for people like you. The church's grip started early. You'd be baptized as an infant, locking you into the system before you could talk. From then on, every major life event required church approval. Marriage, childbirth, death, all needed priestly blessings. Even your work schedule revolved around church bells ringing out prayer times. Sundays weren't optional. They were mandatory under penalty of law. Missing Mass could mean public flogging or worse, depending on how cranky the local priest was feeling. Salvation wasn't free either. You paid for it through tithes. 10% of everything you produced, taken right off the top. That pig you raised, church gets the hams. That bushel of wheat you harvested, they'll take a gallon. No exceptions, even in famine years. The church became Europe's wealthiest landlord through the system, amassing fortunes while peasants starved. Refusing to pay meant excommunication, being cut off from all sacraments and becoming a social outcast. No baptisms, no marriages, no last rites. Just eternal hellfire waiting for you. Heretics had it worse. Disagree with church teachings? That's a burning. Question the Pope's authority? Enjoy the Iron Maiden. The Inquisition wasn't picky about evidence. Confessions obtained through torture were perfectly valid. Devices like the Judas cradle, exactly as awful as it sounds, or the pair of anguish don't ask, persuaded even the most stubborn doubters. Public execution served as entertainment and warning. Watching someone burn alive for translating the Bible tended to discourage independent thinking. Pilgrimages offered glimmer of hope, but at great risk. A journey to Canterbury or Rome might shave years off your sentence in purgatory. If bandits, disease, or fraudulent innkeepers didn't get you first, the roads crawled with criminals preying on pilgrims. Many never returned. Those who did often came back missing fingers or savings. The church sold detective relics, supposed bones of saints that usually turned out to be chicken bones. But hey, better safe than sorry when your immortal soul was on the line. The fear wasn't abstract. It was deliberately cultivated. Church art showed demons devouring sinners in graphic detail. Preachers described hell's torries so vividly people fainted. Your average peasant knew exactly which sins would get you boiled, burned, or frozen for eternity. Even thoughts could damn you. The church taught that fantasizing about sin was just as bad as doing it. No wonder people hallucinated demons everywhere. The church assured them hell was always one slip-up away. Clergy weren't exactly model citizens either, while preaching chastity. Priests kept mistresses openly. Monasteries stockpiled gold while their neighbors starved. Bishops lived like kings, ignoring the poverty around them. The same church that banned gambling ran the medieval equivalent of casinos. Rules existed to keep peasants in line, not the clergy. Try complaining, and you learn firsthand about their torture chambers. Education was another form of control. Monks copied books by hand, but only church-approved ones. Universities trained scholars. To think exactly what the church wanted, alternative ideas were burned along with their authors. Want to read the Bible yourself? Too bad. It was in Latin, a language peasants didn't speak. Knowledge was power, and the church kept those locked up tight. Women suffered extra layers of control. The church labeled them morally weak temptresses, while depending on their donations and labor. Nuns lived as virtual prisoners. Their convents controlled by male clergy. Midwives risked accusations of witchcraft for knowing too much about herbs. Even marriage became a church monopoly. No wedding without priestly approval, and absolutely no divorce no matter how abusive the husband. Death brought the final shakedown. Dying without last rites doomed your soul. So the church had leverage. Relatives paid hefty fees for funeral masses to shorten purgatory time. The wealthy bought chantries. Entire chapels where priests would pray for their souls around the clock. Peasants mortgaged their futures for a few mumbled prayers. The fear didn't end at death. The church ensured you'd keep worrying even in the afterlife. Fear worked better than swords. Armies could enforce rules, but terror enforced belief. People policed themselves, reporting neighbors for heresy to prove their own loyalty. Families turned in relatives over theological disagreements. The church didn't need spies when everyone was terrified into submission. This atmosphere of suspicion lingered for centuries, long after the Middle Ages ended. But not everyone bought it. Secret movements like the Cathars and Lollards challenged church authority at enormous personal risk. Their suppressed ideas would later fuel Reformation fires. Some peasants just went through the motions, cursing the church in private, while crossing themselves in public. But open defiance? That took bravery bordering on madness when the punishment of being slowly roasted alive in town square. And if religion didn't kill you, the war might. Medieval battlefields were meat grinders where armored psychopaths hacked peasant apart for petty noble squabbles, while priests preached peace. Kings used religion to justify slaughter on an industrial scale. Your quiet village would become a blood-soaked ruin overnight because two rich men disagreed about theology, or more often, about money and land. Ever argued with a neighbor? Medieval lords settled disputes with armies instead of lawsuits. Wars weren't special events. They were background noise that never stopped. While we worry about traffic jams, peasants worried about armored knights trampling their crops during someone else's land dispute. The battlefield wasn't some distant place. It could roll through your village any afternoon without warning. Peasants became soldiers whether they wanted to or not. If you were a free male, you were automatically a soldier when your lord demanded it. One day you'd be harvesting barley. The next you'd be handed a rusted spear and shoved toward an approaching cavalry charge. No training, no armor, just raw peasant flesh against professional killers. Most didn't survive their first battle. Those who did often came back missing limbs or carrying infections that would slowly finish the job. Castles weren't fairy tale palaces. They were meat grinders. Pretty stone towers? Those were giant targets for trebuchets. Majestic gates? designed to funnel attackers into killing zones. A siege meant months trapped inside walls while disease and hunger did the enemy's work for them. Defenders dumped boiling oil and feces on heads below. When supplies ran low, they'd toss out the wounded and elderly first. Romantic? Try living on rat and shoe leather, while arrows rained through arrow slits. The countryside suffered worst during wars. Armies didn't just pass through. They lived off the land, which meant stealing everything you'd spent a year growing. Soldiers burned fields to starve enemies, slaughtered livestock for one meal, dumped grain stores into rivers just because they could. Your choices were simple. Hand over your food and starve later, or resist and get slaughtered now. Either way, winter would finish what the soldiers started. Peace treaties were jokes that nobody believed. Conflict is a way of life. Peace is just a pause between two invasions. Temporary truces might last weeks before some nephew's insult or disputed sheep started the killing again. Lords signed agreements on parchment, while keeping their swords sharp. Villagers knew better than to relax. The next war ban was always just over the horizon. Civilians were targets, not bystanders. Soldiers raped and pillaged as standard practice. Whole villages were torch fodder to deprive enemies of resources. Women and children weren't spared. They were valuable loot to be taken or killed depending on the mood. Survivors often wished they died too when facing starvation without homes or crops. Medical care on battlefields didn't exist. Arrow wounds fester for weeks before killing you. Broken limbs never set right. Infection spread through camps like gossip. Surgeons were butchers who amputated with dirty saws. If you were lucky enough to have one nearby, most just bled out in mud, while comrades looted their bodies. Siege warfare was psychological torture. Attackers built towers higher than your walls while you watched helplessly. They catapult dead horses over the fences to spread disease. Sometimes they just sit outside and let starvation do the work, enjoying campfires while your children wasted away inside. Negotiating surrender was risky. Many commanders slaughtered defenders anyway as examples. Knights weren't noble heroes. They were thugs with good PR. Chivalry only applied to other nobles, never peasants. That shining armor paid for by crushing taxes. Those noble steeds fed better than your children. A knight's idea of fun was practicing sword moves on bound prisoners. Tournaments simulated war, because these guys loved violence that much. Fortifications ate up resources that could have fed people. Peasants spent months dragging stone for walls that would be breached in days. Forests were cleared to deny cover to attackers, eliminating firewood sources. Every castle built meant another 100 families going hungry, so some lord could play king of the hill. The rare professional soldiers were worse than the conscripts. Mercenaries worked for whoever paid most, switching sides mid-battle. Unpaid troops routinely mutinied and sacked their own towns. Disbanded armies became roving bandit gangs. There was no version where peasants won, just different flavors of losing. War shaped the medieval mindset completely. People named their kids after famous battles, like we name pets after movie characters. Church art showed saints crushing infidels rather than preaching peace. Even merchants armed their carts like miniature fortresses. Violence wasn't exceptional. It was expected, like bad weather. Peasants developed grim survival tactics. Some villages built secret underground tunnels to hide enduring raids. Others paid protection money to local warlords, essentially bribing their own future attackers. A few pretended loyalty to whichever army was nearby, while secretly cursing both sides. Mostly they just hoped to be ignored. The aftermath lingered for generations. Fields took years to recover from salt and fire. Surviving men came back traumatized but had to keep working. Children grew up hearing war stories as cautionary tales, then repeated the cycle when conscription notices came. War wasn't just an event. It was the backdrop to every life. And if war didn't kill you, the aftermath might. Destroyed villages left people homeless just as winter approached. Burned crops meant years of famine. Lingering mercenaries turned into highway robbers. The lucky died quickly in battle. The unlucky spent decades picking up the pieces only to watch new armies trample them again. Ever cleaned up after a party? Medieval villages spent entire lifetimes cleaning up after wars. The moment soldiers marched away, Survivors crawled out of hiding to find their world in ashes. Fields that fed families for generations were black and stubble. Livestock were gone, stolen or slaughtered. Fruit trees chopped down for season. This wasn't cleanup. It was starting over from nothing with hands still shaking from trauma. Food shortages hit immediately. Burned crops meant no bread until next harvest, if they could plant at all. Stolen livestock meant no milk, no meat, no plow animals. People dug through ruins for half-charred grain or chewed on boiled tree bark. Wells were often poisoned with corpses by retreating armies, forcing survivors to drink from mud puddles. Starvation killed slowly while diseases from poor sanitation worked faster. The lucky died quickly. The unlucky wasted away watching their children do the same. Housing was the next crisis. Soldiers burned roofs first. Easy targets that left walls standing but useless. Families crammed into surviving structures. 10 people to a room meant for 4. Makeshift shelters of branches, and dirt offered little against winter storms. Without tools or nails, repairs took months. Many just lived in the ruins, sleeping under open skies until exposure took them. The concept of insurance didn't exist. You rebuilt with whatever you could scavenge or beg from equally desperate neighbors. Psychological wounds went untreated. Modern terms like PTSD didn't exist, but the symptoms did: nightmares, flashbacks, uncontrollable shakes. Some couldn't work fields where they'd seen family murdered. Others jumped at every shout, reliving battles. Children who witnessed atrocities grew into traumatized adults, passing their fears to the next generation. The church offered prayers, but what survivors really needed was food and rest no one could provide. Work never stopped despite exhaustion. Fields needed replanting before seasons changed. Fences required rebuilding before wolves got the remaining livestock. Every task took twice as long with half the tools. Bodies ached from dawn till dusk, while stomachs stayed empty. Older villagers worked until they collapsed, knowing survival depended on it. Children as young as 5 hauled water or gathered firewood. Playtime was a luxury no one could afford anymore. Crime exploded in the aftermath. Raiders who missed the war came for pickings afterward. Starving neighbors stole from each other's scant supplies. Orphaned children formed desperate gangs. With no functioning courts, justice meant mob violence or bloody vendettas. The same hands that rebuilt walls also broke others' bones over stolen terms. Communities fractured along new lines of who had food and who didn't. Tax collectors arrived remarkably fast. Lords demanded payments even from ruined villages, taking whatever scraps remained. Those who couldn't pay lost land to wealthier survivors. A death sentence slower than any battle. The feudal system kept grinding even through catastrophe, pressing the wounded under its wheels. Some families became permanent beggars. Others sold themselves into serfdom just for daily bread. Diseases thrived in weakened populations. Malnutrition made colds fatal. Wounds from rebuilding festered, without medicine. Contaminated water brought dysentery. Plague often followed armies, finishing what sword started. Grave diggers became permanent village positions, though there were rarely enough hands to bury properly. Pits held dozens at once, names forgotten by necessity. Cultural losses cut deep. The old storytellers, who died, took generations of oral history with them. Burned churches lost irreplaceable art. Songs and recipes disappeared when those who knew them starved. Children grew up not knowing traditions their grandparents had cherished. There was no time for storytelling when survival demanded every waking moment. Hope came in slow increments. The first green shoots in burned fields. A wandering hen returning to lay eggs. An unbroken cooking pot found in rubble. Survivors measured progress in these tiny victories, while ignoring how far they still had to go. Some villages never fully recovered, becoming ghost towns within decades. Others rebuilt, but the scars remained visible. Patched walls, younger trees, empty spaces at community tables. Generations carried the damage forward. Children born after war grew up stunted from maternal malnutrition. Land disputes from the chaos flared up decades later. Distrust of outsiders hardened into cultural paranoia. The psychological burden manifested in superstitious rituals, new charms on doorways, compulsive warding gestures, obsessive church attendance. Peace never felt permanent, the memory of loss remained so vivid. Yet people kept going. However slowly, fields were replanted. However shakily, hands rebuilt walls. However reluctantly, survivors honor the dead by continuing to live. There were no grand triumphs, just a stubborn refusal to disappear completely. Days blurred into seasons, seasons into years, until one day villagers realized the war stories were being told to children who hadn't been alive for the horror. And yet humanity endured, despite every possible disadvantage. People patched together some version of normalcy, not because they were heroic, but because the alternative was unthinkable. Tomorrow's meal needed cooking. Next winter's firewood required chopping. Life narrowed to immediate necessities, and in that narrowing, found a way forward. The Middle Ages didn't end because things got easier. They ended because generations of survivors kept adding one stubborn stone to pile until, centuries later, it became a foundation for something new. The Middle Ages weren't just hard. They were a daily gauntlet of plague, starvation, and backbreaking labor. Every sunrise brought new ways to die horribly. Yet here we are today, because people endure that nightmare with nothing but stubbornness and the occasional half-rotten turnip. So next time your Wi-Fi's slow or your coffee's lukewarm, remember, at least you're not picking lice out of your straw mattress while dodging the Black Death. If you survived this trip through medieval misery, hit like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments which horror shocked you most. Sweet dreams, and maybe hug your mattress tonight.